Mr President, let me start with an accusatory question to the Commissioner. Some of us have called repeatedly over the years and pointed out repeatedly over the years that the car makers were failing to comply with the terms of the voluntary agreement to reduce emissions. So why is it that after some 5 years after this first became evident, we still do not have legislation before us requiring the manufacturers to meet the agreed targets? Because with each month of delay, it becomes harder to achieve the ambitions which were originally possible. And this sets the framework for today's debate. Average emissions from new cars stand now at a little less than 160 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre, a long way adrift from the target of 140 grams by 2008. And so it is not surprising that members here want car makers to be punished for breaking their commitment. Yet the fact is that the manufacturers have broken no laws, and however much we may wish it were otherwise, the level of emissions is where it is. Now, the Commission has announced that it wants to stick to the medium-term target set in that voluntary agreement of 120 grams by 2012, but says that 10 grams of this will now be achieved by complementary measures. I call this a political fudge. It has reduced the clarity of the target and encouraged some manufacturers to think that they can use biofuels as a means of avoiding significant design changes. But given where we are, is the target and the timetable set by the Commission still appropriate? Because of late, the reduction in average emissions has been hardly more than 1 gram a year. The Commission suggests that this should instantly be transformed into 5 grams a year. Well, that can be achieved, and the technology exists to do it, but at what cost? Emission reductions must be made a priority for car makers, but they have got to be achieved at the lowest possible expense, and that means giving industry specific targets and sufficient time to make the changes. These improvements, of course, may increase the price of new cars, but then reduced emissions mean improved fuel economy, so those who buy the cars will save money as they drive them. And get it right, and we can take action which will be good for the environment and good for the consumer and good for the future of car making. Now, there is a debate in this Parliament about whether, in a pre-legislative report of this kind, environmentalists should be pressing to send a strong signal to the Commission to be tough, or whether we should actually try to be realistic in framing measures which might actually be those that end up close to the final form at the end of the day. And that is why I am asking the Parliament to break from the Commission position and recommend that the target for average emissions from new cars should be set not for 2012 but for the year 2015, and should be 125 grams to be achieved by technical means alone. By all means, let us encourage the use of complementary measures to reduce emissions, but as an addition, not as a substitute for these technical improvements. And to those members who say this is not sufficient, let me just say that next month we will be voting on the Cars 21 report, and in that the recommendation is 135 grams by 2015. We could end up voting for one thing this month and something else next month. And if I can help bring together the different positions of the Industry Committee and the Environment Committee, then I believe it will strengthen Parliament's position and influence. I believe that manufacturers should be set absolutely clear targets with no room for wriggling. And this report insists that failure to comply should result in the application of tough financial penalties. I propose an internal trading mechanism to give manufacturers maximum flexibility and give incentives to the makers of low emission vehicles. But ultimately, it is the penalty regime that matters, and that, I suspect, will test the Commission's resolve. Equally important is the need to set long-term targets to reduce emissions to below 100 grams by 2020. Given sufficient time and an absolute requirement, I have no doubt that manufacturers can achieve reductions of nearly 40% over the next 13 years. Finally, let me just touch upon the way in which cars are promoted. The manufacturers always claim that they respond to consumer demand, but I do not believe this. I believe they shape consumer demand. Studies have shown that a very high proportion of advertising expenditure goes towards the promotion of cars on the basis of power and size and speed. The car industry is supposed to be drawing up a voluntary code of advertising conduct, but we have had our fingers burnt with voluntary codes, and any such measure should be regarded with suspicion. It is time that advertisements give consumers more details of the fuel economy and emission performance of the vehicles on sale. This information should be upfront and not buried away in the small print. We need to encourage car makers to compete on the basis that their cars are safe and stylish and environmentally friendly. President, let me just finish with these remarks. Europe's car makers produce fine vehicles. The technical expertise of the companies themselves is much to be admired. But for too long, they've ignored the contribution their products are making to the threat posed by climate change. For the sake of the planet, for the good of an industry that needs to stay at the cutting edge of world-class technology, it's time now for lawmakers to steer them firmly in a greener direction. Thank you, President.